Well, welcome everyone. It is good to see you on this third Wednesday night of this Advent season. Thanks for coming and joining us. It's a privilege for me to have Pastor Chelsea Pearsall joining with me tonight. And Chelsea was an intern with us for a number of years and then went on her way and we dragged her back. And she is our campus pastor at our Middleton campus and just a delight. I knew I was going to like Chelsea. Uh, from the moment I met her, she started teasing me relentlessly, and she was the first person to decide that she could just walk in my office like that. It didn't matter. She just walks in and starts talking. And so we've had a great friendship, and I'm thrilled to get to pastor and minister with her. And she's doing a great job in Middleton. I tease her. We had a town hall meeting there a few weeks ago, and it was clear they tolerate me and they adore her. And so we're thrilled that she's with us on staff. Tonight, Chelsea and I are going to reflect with you about joy and love because we won't be together next week. We will think about both joy and love together. But let me open our time. I'm going to mess this up for those of you with the devotional. Today, Caleb is helping us kind of monitor all these things. And today is Caleb's 27th birthday, which is crazy. I became a dad 27 years ago, and he reminded me this week that I'm 54, which means this is the halfway point, that he has been in my life as long as he was not in my life. And now that this is the tipping point. But wonderful kid, and just so thankful for him. But it made me think about parenting and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm going to use Saturday's devotional on joy to start us out with. It's from Hebrews 12, 1-3. The writer of Hebrews says this: "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." So I say this: my wife is an amazing mother. She's the queen of positive reinforcement. Because I've been in ministry during our entire marriage, I usually have to leave early and head for the church on Sundays before the rest of the family gets out of bed. That has meant she's had to take on the monumental task of getting 4 kids ready for church and there on time. I suppose a parent could get 4 young kids to church with various threats and forms of coercion. It is unlikely they would grow up being glad to go to the house of the Lord, but I suppose it's possible. Fortunately, Debbie took a more positive route. There was a donut store between our home and the church, and if everyone was dressed and ready to go on time, they got to stop on the way. As the kids got older, the dangling carrot of motivation was upgraded from the donut store to Starbucks, but the principle remained the same. The kids would get ready efficiently because of the vision of maple bars and chocolate milk in their minds. It was the goal toward which each Sunday morning was directed. Ancient Greek philosophers, in particular Aristotle, called this kind of goal a telos. The telos is the target, the goal, the picture of where we want to be or what we want to accomplish that still lies out in the future ahead of us. Students study hard in order to earn a degree. Workers strive to finish a project and earn a salary. Authors push through writer's block for that wonderful day when a box of first edition books shows up at the house. Using the metaphor from the writer of Hebrews in today's text, runners run the race with the finish line or destination in mind. In this text, Jesus endured his sufferings with a particular telos in mind, the joy set before him. What is the telos of joy set before Jesus? The writer of Hebrews doesn't articulate all that the joy of Christ means in this text, but the writer seems to assume that the reader already understands all of the joyful transformations that have taken and are taking place through the cross and resurrection. Christ endured the suffering of the cross for the joy of forming a world where good overcomes evil. Christ endured the suffering of the cross for the joy of forming a world where light overpowers darkness. Christ endured the suffering of the cross for the joy of forming a world where grace conquers sin. And Christ endured the suffering of the cross for the joy of forming a world where death is vanquished by resurrection life. The logic of this powerful text in Hebrews is pretty straightforward. If the joyful telos of a world set right in God's love is the goal that helped Jesus endure the great suffering of the cross, then as we suffer and struggle in the race set before us, our telos, our goal, and our vision should be Christ. We run the race of our lives with our eyes fixed on Jesus and the joy we know will come when the world is set right in and through him. Several years ago, I ran the Los Angeles Marathon. I was struggling to finish with 7 or 8 miles still to go in the race. I was running to support a Christian organization that had made T-shirts for all the team members with Philippians 4:13 printed on the back. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. A man coming up behind me in the race apparently read my T-shirt and could see that I was struggling. So he came up beside me, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Brother, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Say it with me." It was clear he wasn't going to take no for an answer. So with as much energy as I could muster, I started repeating Philippians 4:13 with him over and over again. He invited other runners around us to join in the mantra. For about a mile, a whole group of us ran chanting together, "I can do all things through him who gives me strength." A combination of faith and embarrassment helped me forget my pain, and I was able to finish the race. My new friend stayed with me until we reached the telos, the finish line together, and there was much rejoicing. For the writer of Hebrews, the race we run is not done alone. It is not the kind of race we run in order to finish ahead of other runners. It's the kind of race where we lose if someone fails to finish. Jesus endured the cross for the sake of the joyful telos of a world reconciled to God and to one another. With our eyes fixed on Jesus, our goal is not to beat others to the end. Our goal is to make sure that everyone, every tribe, nation, and language join in God's reconciled new creation. Only when everyone finishes this goal can we say that our joy is indeed complete. Let me pray for us as we begin tonight. God, thanks again for this season, and especially tonight. Thank you that we get to celebrate these qualities of joy and love that are defined ultimately by you and by your Son Jesus. Help us tonight to better understand what it means to be people who are filled with joy and people who are shaped and formed by your love. I pray especially for those who are suffering and struggling tonight, for whom joy seems very distant and where isolation makes love seem far removed. May you draw near, and may your joy and your love break in tonight. Even in our own congregation, we've had folks lose a couple of loved ones in these last few days, and I pray your peace for those families and for those who are struggling and those who are sick all around our world. Bring your healing and your grace. But be with us tonight, even in this scattered way. May you be in the center of our conversation. Thanks for Chelsea and her ministry. Bless our words, and may you be glorified in all that's said and done tonight. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, Chelsea, again, good to have you with me. So one of the things that has been interesting, again, for me during this Advent season, and it's kind of a theme that we've come back to again and again, is that these qualities that we've been celebrating, hope, peace, and now joy and love, they're words, especially shaped by the gospel, that are deep and rich and kind of hard to get at. So in the first week, we had all this conversation about how hope is very different than optimism, and how peace, last week Diane and I talked about how peace is not like the world gives. The world gives peace that is just basically the kind of absence or suspension of conflict, but shalom is something deeper and richer than that. I think the same is true for us tonight, that joy is something that is much deeper than happiness. Happiness is can be kind of a problematic word. You and I talked about how the Common English Bible is trying to recapture something like by translating the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 with happy are those who mourn, which is always kind of problematic. But nevertheless, happy seems like kind of a lesser form than joy. And then love, English is just a mess. We only get one word for love. And so the same word that applies to God's love for us, we apply to how we feel about pizza, which is problematic. And Greek has a few more terms to kind of help us flesh that out. But talk to me a little bit about joy and love and how we can kind of get at that. I know that you have a love for art and that kind of stuff. So talk to us a little bit about trying to get at the richness of joy and love. And you'll have to, oh, there you go. You unmuted yourself.
I didn't know if my laughter would interrupt you, so I figured I would mute myself
It
for a
never
little
bothers
bit.
me. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, you said all kinds of things using English words that are sometimes helpful and sometimes really unhelpful, right? A part of talking about peace is talking about shalom and talking about the concept of shalom, right? And the culture of that and all of these things that go with that. And for love, right, we think, or in Hebrew, right, we have chesed, and as you like to do, right, make sure you do that.
Right.
Um,
Please spit.
but how even describing that as God's love is really difficult. But trying to like pull together some English words to try and get this concept that um, is just so in so many ways like foreign. And even right, I love in your devotional, and I've been reading "Surprised by Joy" by C.S. Lewis. But it kind of cracked me up when in talking and preparing for this, as I was reading that little snippet from it, even that little snippet, if I were to say, right, what is the definition of joy from this? Even that quote is isn't necessarily direct, right? It's a right. C.S. Lewis is talking about once you've experienced it, right? You want that again. And it kind of fades away, but it's not happiness, and it's not our desires or passion, those kinds of things. It's something totally different. And I I continued to think of this outright like unspeakable joy, the ways that we talk about. Sometimes there are feelings, there are commitments, there are words and cultures and ideas that we can't always get across with like a straight up definition. We can't always get across with just a quote. And so for me, as you mentioned, I lean into the arts, right? So because art it transcends all languages, right? You don't have to know English to read this. You don't have to know Hebrew to kind of get this concept, this idea. And one of my favorite artists, so he's a painter, but he also writes, is Makoto Fujimura, and he goes by Mako, is how I'll refer to him. He's an abstract artist that he started his artwork not being a Christian and has this great testimony, this great story, and he's at Fuller Seminary and does a lot of things on culture care, which is another piece of this. But he uses a lot of gold. So he uses gold leaf and like gold powder. And so I will try to share my screen where you can see, oh, maybe I can't. Wait for it. I might be able to. But where I don't know if you can make me a co-host real quick. But this perfect. So where Mako, right, what he does and what I love is this gold leaf. And so he has this series called the Gold Sea or the Golden Sea, where again, abstract. And he, at different points, he was invited to add art to the four gospels. I have it, it's huge, it's printed. But gold, right, being this as a grad student, this overly expensive right, piece of element to his artwork where people were like, why are you doing this? Right? They asked him, why are you adding this real gold to these pieces when you can't afford it, right? Or it just doesn't make sense. And he talks about how his use of gold was very, very intentional. And you see it in a lot of his pieces where that gold representing all kinds of things. But for me, I see it in some sense as this joy, as this richness, right? This depth. And he talks about it in this way of, it's really, it's almost wasteful, right? as this grad student, it's this kind of wasteful, but also really beautiful and an expressive element. And so it's this both and, right, of being expressive, being really intentional, and being in a lot of ways like freely given, or freely distributed. So it's not it's not restrained. And this is a part of in your devotional, right? I love that aspect of you can't contain this, right? These things can't be contained. And so this joy, right? Joy can't be contained. And so for me, right, the joy in a lot of ways, especially, and again, for me in this gold, reminds me, right, of abundance, right? When we talk about the liturgy of abundance. For me, it's this contrast, right? You have this shiny gold to a matte paint that sometimes is dark, sometimes isn't. But it's for me, right? Joy becomes this expression of the liturgy of abundance in the face of the myth of scarcity, right? Where instead of saying, no, I don't have enough, even saying, I don't have enough joy to give to everyone else. I don't have enough love to give to everyone else, right? The liturgy of abundance says, yes, you do. And you do because God has enough joy. Like
Right. Right.
God has the joy. God has enough love. Um, and I really love Mako for a lot of different reasons. Again, he also talks about the ways in which artwork, and so again, just kind of thinking of artwork, but he talks about artwork not just being um, like music or dance or visual arts, um, or even culinary arts, because I get a lot of joy right out of eating. My placemats have joy on them. They're coming around a table, all those kinds of fun things. But he talks about um, joy impacting everything that we do, and joy and the arts being a type of relationship where if you are creating or if you are acting in the way that you were created for, then you are bringing God joy, right? So if me as a created one, if I am creating, and there's a lot of creation, right? But that's bringing joy. I'm receiving that and I'm expressing that. And so this is where, right, for Mako, it's this extraordinary, extravagant wastefulness. We could see it as wasteful, right? Where joy doesn't make sense right now in a lot of ways, right? For those who mourn, for those who are sorrowful, it may seem wasteful to those around us, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense. And so for me, right, the arts, and not just visual arts, but even right, the arts of sports, the arts of someone coming around you chanting, right?
Right.
I
Yeah.
can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, right? And that community and that beauty. And so for me, very much connecting joy to the arts, but beauty, and again, beauty not just being a visual or auditory, right, representation, but also the ways in which we interact with each other. That can be an art, right? The ways that we communicate can be beautiful, or it cannot.
Right. And so in some ways, what Mako is trying to do visually is what C.S.
Mhm,
Lewis is trying to articulate in words in Surprised by
mhm,
Joy, is that it is almost as though, in the same way that Fujimura is trying to weave little
mhm.
strands of gold in all of his work, that surprises us, right?
Yes. Yep.
God has woven in his presence, his renewal, his renovation, his new
Mhm.
creation in
Yep.
ways that are not always recognizable, and are mixed with tones, with other different tones that life experiences. But we're constantly surprised again by the joy that we find in God's
Mhm,
presence and God's renewal. So Sunday, I if I could go back to Sunday just a little bit, as we talked about Jubilee,
mhm,
and I've talked about that a lot. I feel like, especially because I kind of lecture on those economic codes every semester and all that kind of stuff, and I do love the way that Isaiah 61 is woven into the way Luke
mhm.
understands the ministry of Jesus, and I do think Luke and Acts both are books about how Christ brings Jubilee and everything is changed. Even to Peter and Cornelius, learning to be brothers together is a form
Mhm.
of Jubilee for Luke.
Yep.
Um, but I tried to kind of turn that a little bit Sunday to say there's certainly joy for those who receive God's do-over. And so often the scripture talks about those who sow in tears will reap in joy.
Mhm.
And there is this idea of what it means to be the recipient of that overwhelming sense of grace. And certainly there's joy there, and much we could celebrate. But there's joy in being the prophet who gets to pronounce that jubilee.
Mm.
And part of God's I think part of the joy that of God is to pronounce that jubilee, is to free captives and to
Mhm.
bring sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. That this is the source of God's delight and joy.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's the source of then the prophet's joy, is to be able to pronounce that. And yet, I mean, part of the scriptural part of me thinks about I'm constantly trying to finish this book on Jonah, where Jonah misses out on that, where Jonah
Mhm.
part of the point of the book of Jonah is God's renovating Nineveh, and God's people are missing out on it. So talk to me about what do you sense are some of the reasons why we fail to see the gold that's woven into the painting? Why is it that we fail to see the joy and be surprised by it or participate in God's jubilee?
Yeah. I think a part of it, right? I think of both Jonah and Job's friends in the midst of Job's suffering, right? And how Job, at the beginning of all of this tragedy, right, things are taken away, and his family is decimated, and his wife says, "Curse God and die," right? Great encouraging moments. But we have his friends who come, and for a moment there, I think they kind of get it, right, where they kind of see the gold, the joy of being together, and in the fact that in togetherness of sitting with their friend Job in mourning, they get this, and then they start talking, which is when everything starts to go downhill, right, where they start to try and kind of figure out. I think they try and explain things away, and in some sense probably a type of control, right? If we can explain it, then I can kind of control the outcome. I can control why this happened. I can make sure this doesn't happen again. Where the world, and we have all experienced it, right, there are things out of our control, for better and for worse. Right, God and Jonah, right, like God's love is not in our control. We can be an instrument of it, but that doesn't mean that we get to tell God, no, 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 those people aren't included. What makes me also laugh about Jonah, right, is he is I love the kind of saying that, like, he's the most effective prophet or preacher, right? He has however many words, and a whole city, and the camel, or not the camels, but the cows and the chickens or goats and sheep, right? All of it has turned to God. And instead of rejoicing in that, right, he is sour. He is unhappy, and he is mad because he knew that God's love was enough. He knew that people would take hold of that. He knew that that gold, right, that this joy couldn't be contained, couldn't be controlled. So sometimes I think it's a part of control, especially when and trying to explain things. I think it's really hard for us for mystery to happen, right? For us not to be able to understand. Again, the as you had described, a friend who's going through, who is really ill, they have a joy that you like we can't always explain, and so not being able to explain that, I think, is really, really difficult, right? We want to be able to see, this is where it came from, this is how I replicate it, right? Even like, what is my equation for joy? Because if I don't know how I got it, I don't know how to share it. And so it's kind of this, what is what is my equation, right? What is the plan for this? And so, and also for Jubilee, when we think about this, sometimes Jubilee, as you had also mentioned, is something that seems so not unapproachable, but like we can't obtain it, right? It's so far-fetched, right? It's so far-fetched, it's so extraordinary, that or extravagant, that there's no way we would be able to live into that. So if I can't live into it, then I'm not going to have you live into it. Right? I think a part of that is, if we can't see it for ourselves, then it's really difficult to see it for someone else. Um, Unless, right, this is where I think some of Diane's perspective from last week, right? And those who have been sinned against, those who are mourning, those who are sorrowful, like yearning for that, and have that as this hope, this possibility that there can be joy. But and so there's it just kind of depends on where we're at. But I in Jubilee, I think, as you were talking about the prophetic imagination, right, a part of what Jubilee does is helps us to see something that is possible. This is even, right, the new creation of, if we can't believe in the new creation, like if we really don't believe in the new creation, that we can experience like those foretaste of the kingdom, those moments now, then we're not going to live like it's possible. We're not going to act in that way. Sometimes I think we're really comfortable with the rhythms that we have, where Jubilee upsets that. It, again, we don't have control over it. My land is no longer my land. The debt that I paid off, I feel like, was a waste of those years, because I could have just waited until Jubilee and racked up as much debt as I wanted. Although on Sunday when you were preaching, I'm all in favor. You can totally pay my debts.
Yeah.
Maybe Jubilee for you, Pastor Scott, is paying my school
Yes,
debts.
right. Maybe that would bring me joy, Chelsea. Yeah.
That would bring me such joy.
Right.
I think sometimes too, and as we were joking of you saying, I don't always know if we're aware of situations that we can be a part of, that need joy. Sometimes I think we also see to ourselves, or like we come to ourselves and try and bring joy to ourselves, instead of seeing Jubilee as a gift that is not just to be kept for myself, but that is one to be stewarded well, right? So it's a part of that is stewardship. And so we can be so focused on me, right, where on my own needs, where I forget, or just blindsided, right, blind spot of oh, like there are those around me. And Jubilee is so intertwined, right? Or it's so interconnected with person and person, but land, right? This physical, this all of these kinds of aspects, excuse me, where it can be so overwhelming, and I don't know I don't have my equation for it. What does it mean? How do I do this? I don't know what it looks like. And so sometimes we don't even have the imagination for it. Again, to say, oh, Jubilee is possible. This is what it could look like, because it's just so out there. And so I don't want to try, because I'm afraid to fail even, right? There's, I think, even that of, I don't think it's possible for me to do that. I don't think I have the abilities, or I've even, I think, feeling like I haven't experienced it myself to then be able to share to others.
Yeah. I've been,
things.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the, Brueggemann's Liturgy of Abundance and Myth of Scarcity. But I've been thinking about, I've talked about that a lot, but I've been realizing how much, even in my own imagination, we think of life as a kind of zero-sum game, meaning if somebody has something, then I don't. So you mentioned sports, in any athletic, as the NFL kind of winds down its season, it's as though one team's going to walk off having all of the joy and everybody else are losers, right? So no matter what they accomplished, it wasn't meaningful. Only one team got to win. And I've been thinking about even when I hear about churches, for example, that are doing good things in our community, there's a part of me that knows the right answer is to say, oh, that's great. Like the kingdom of God is expanding. But usually people are telling it to me, hey, did you hear what's going on? But they're telling it to me not as a source of joy, but as a source of, well, what's wrong with us? Why haven't we been doing that? Or even not to create trouble in our own house, but even as we think about what does it mean to be a church that may have more than one, now has 2 locations, may have more. I think even the mindset of what does it mean for other places to thrive, being connected to what it means for us all together to thrive. And then that if one group gets attention, it doesn't mean that we're not getting attention. Like we have to break out of that kind of mentality in order to participate in a kind of jubilee that brings new life and brings celebration and brings goodness and brings joy. So we got to move to love or we'll be here all week. But I did want to show, I thought this was great on Facebook this week. I saw this, somebody took a picture of somebody's neighbor. I don't know if you guys can see that well, but how 2020 feels. The J blew over, and so this is the year of not of joy, but of oi, oi. So
Yes.
Chelsea, this has been a hard year for all of us to learn to practice joy. Just briefly, what are some ways that you have tried to practice joy during these last 9-10 months?
Yeah. A part of that has been, again, so for me, right, with the arts, and just the idea of creativity, right, of what does it mean to be creative in the ways that we connect with one another, what are new things that we can do, and I think getting excited and finding joy in the fact that there are there are totally new things that we had never thought of before, that we are now entering into, that, right, it has just exploded our pre-thoughts, our pre-imaginations, right, for what church can look like, for what it means to have family gatherings, what it means to, for we got a dog this season, right? So even for me, like having like my dog is a source of joy. But a part of that, right, is connecting to creation, right? Like, as silly as that may sound, but my dog definitely brings me joy, sometimes concern, but right, but I'm connecting with things that have also been created, and then finding ways for us to create in new ways, or to see things like we've never seen before and get excited about that. But a part of that for me has also been, um, uh, has been lamenting the things and the changes, right? So for me, I've had to do both. For me, it's kind of this hand in hand experience where I think in order for me to fully be able to find joy in these new things, I've had to lament and even confess when I've blocked my own vision from seeing what's new, right? When I've kind of lived in these patterns where I haven't allowed for, right, God to come in, or for me to stop and be outside, even, right, taking walks and having artwork, we reading, even, right, a part of staying inside. What does that mean to stay inside? What does it mean to work from home? What does it mean to have phone calls? um, and even, right, writing postcards, some of those for me, right, as a pastor, of what are those kinds of things, and how do we live into them in ways where we choose to see the joy, right, where we choose to see where God is still working, and to not give up hope in the fact that God is still with us, right? God is still working in and through my life, but also, right, and in through yours, and in through the various people that I have been reading, or on even Instagram, right? Like, I follow um various people, but I'm hearing stories that are inspiring, right? And so being able to connect in these different ways, trying to see the joy in it, while also lamenting in the ways that it is different. It's different than what I expected, than maybe even what I wanted, and confessing of when I held on to my imagination so tightly that it kept me from seeing what is right in front of me, or the possibilities that are right in front of me. And so that's where I think for me, this season, especially, I've been trying to seek joy
Yeah.
and being intentional, right, and in choosing that, and in trying to receive that, instead of just saying I'm done with it all.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point for folks, that joy does not mean that we ignore the things that are really heartbreaking, and lament the things that are really, really sad, and the kind of devastation and loss. However, at the same time, it's been really fun to to see maybe the gold threads. And I love that this season has made new heroes. I mean, it has reminded us of ways that we are connected as communities that we oftentimes overlook. Prior to this, mo- probably many people in the community didn't even know who their mayor was, let alone, tune in to hear what they had to say, or knew where their health clinic was, the health
Yep.
center, where those decision makers, and so much of that has been grieving in some ways. But
Mhm.
the connectedness, the heroes that are our delivery people and our grocers and our toilet paper makers and our teachers and folks that and finding joy in new rhythms and possibilities and reconnecting to some things I think has been really critical. So let's think about love, Chelsea, and think about I'm gonna talk about or have you think with me about what it means to say God is love. And so
Mhm.
you and I like to use this Greek word when we think about the Trinity, perichoresis. And here is thinking of art. Here's a little kind of graphic that is interesting because it's sort of three persons, but the word perichoresis means dance, um, and it is this unending bond, so that there is one, but there's three there. We also have kind of images like this, a perichoretic dance, God is love, sometimes shown in sculptures. And here's one of my favorites, that this idea that when we think about love and we say God is love, we're saying something kind of mysterious about God's own self. And so
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how you understand the perichoretic dance of God without losing everybody. But what do we mean when we say that God is love in that kind of way?
I mean, I don't know. No, just kidding.
Okay.
No, I mean, I love, right, the language that you have on there, eternally making space for one another. That is so significant. And then I am also going to show, I believe, another element to this, another kind of example of what it can be. It's divine dance. So the example, right, that I have um, is of this one where they're all sitting at the table. And this was one for me that I especially love, in part because of, for me, the tie to communion, right? So we have this in food, right? And again, food, I'm telling you, I don't know what it is. But within the Trinity, right, there is this communion, there is this making space, there is this kind of back and forth, again, this dance of being so aware of the other, right, that you know how to move, that you're complementary, that you're not working against. This is too where I think you were talking about, as churches, if we don't have this kind of perichoresis, if we don't have this, we all succeed together, even if our roles may be slightly different, or right, kind of the way that it looks, or that we express ourselves, may be different. But again, it's this divine dance. Even as churches, if we don't have this divine dance, this relationship with each other, then our statement about who God is also as fractured, right? And so I think perichoresis, this this dance again, and I love that it's an art, again, because there's still a little bit of mystery. See, I'm
Right.
telling you, art is so helpful, and also not helpful, because it's also, it can be limiting. But I, right, like for me, the Trinity, right, very much so being relational, and not telling us so much about ourselves, even, right? So being a reflection of God. What does that mean? Well, being created not in one image, but three in one image, and an image that is inherently communal, that can't be without the other. It is only complete with the three, and it can't be disjointed or broken apart. Right? They are never without the other, and it's confusing. Right? This is where, in
Right.
some sense, it is. There is this mystery. There is this mystery of, every time, whenever I've taught um, uh, high school students and junior high students about Trinity, and we try and figure out images, more often than not, they're heretical, right? Because it is so hard to try and find a picture of what in the world does love mean? What does it mean for God to be love? What is God? We try and get this picture, and it's disjointed. But what I love about perichoresis is this image of love. Again, this continually making space for the other while also continually being connected. This is where, again, I think Brent Peterson talked about this 2 weeks ago. Of I can't. What was his? I can't. It wasn't peace. I can't have hope, or I can't have peace. I can't have joy if you don't have it. Right. This is your example of the race. I can't. My well-being, my joy, my wholeness is directly connected to you finishing the race. Right. We need to finish. Like, the race is not just about me finishing, but it's all finishing together.
Yeah.
Um, and so that being so intent, like, just so important to our understanding of who God is, as fundamentally not just love, again, in the sense of like, I love pizza, but of relationships, of commitment, of covenant. Or this is where I love, right, the Old Testament language of covenant, of this is love. This is this continual choice. This is difficult sometimes. Dances take routine, right? Like practice. The arts do, sports do, right? To be good at something, you have to be working at it. You have to be choosing to be getting better and trying, and sometimes failing, but taking one step at a time, and with love, even taking 30 seconds at a time, depending on maybe who you're in contact with. But it's also being in proximity, in one way or another. And that's what I love about that visual. And again, the example that I had with the idea of communion, right, of breaking bread together. And Jesus so often, right, Jesus so often is eating a meal with anyone, and breaking bread, and that being a significant part of, I think, what it can mean to be in relationship with one another. Although this is a time where we have to be really creative in what that means.
Yeah, and I think part of the exile feeling.
Mm,
So I wrote a little blog on Brueggemann's book on virus today, and I have one I'll post tomorrow on NT rights. But
mm,
both of them have talked about kind of this exile theme. That part of what we've
mhm,
learned is that the church, it has the reality in being together, but is more than that as well. And so some of what we ache for is the opportunity to be together. But is for those who we've lost here, um, this part of what we're trying to say, and this is really deep and mysterious, is that the
mm,
Trinity, as has early church theologians thought about it, the Trinity is best understood as God is this entity eternally making space, Father for the Son, Son for the Spirit, Spirit for the
mm,
Father, that constantly, eternally making space without absorbing the other into its essence. Like, that's the kind of mystery of it. It is eternally making space. That's why dancing seems to be the closest thing we can get to a kind of metaphor of not stepping on each other, but making space,
mm,
but being in harmony and in sync with one another. But it makes me think about love then also as a form of making space. So it's appropriate, given that it's Kayla's birthday today, that when we went to drop off a cake and card for him, Debbie was saying, yeah, it's great, we're 27 years without you and 27 years with you. But as Deb said, it's hard to remember, and this is really true
mm,
with 4 kids. It's hard I remember when Caleb came by himself, but it's hard to
mm,
remember our family without all four, without all six of us,
mm, mhm,
because part of what happens is love immediately makes space for this other person. And even
mm,
some folks who are with us who've experienced loss,
mm,
part of what aches is you made that space for the other, but you don't get that space back. That space has been made. And part of, I think, what we celebrate in God's love for us is God not only is this eternal being making space for each other, it is God making space for us, God making space for creation, God in God's self, loving us and loving us so much that has made an eternal space then for these people called his creatures. Um,
mm.
And it makes me realize, part of then what it means to be the church is we are gathered around that table with each other, loving one another, but always with open seats, always
Mhm.
in a posture of being willing to make space for the other. So we got to jump on to some questions. So this is my 2-minute warning for folks that have questions. But um, I did want to show. I love this cartoon that I saw this week. Let me see if I can find it. Um, I'm going to preach on Luke 1 this week, and I love this cartoon. So I may show it Sunday. So laugh again. But I love this. Well, if it isn't Mary and Joseph, um, and all the donkeys and camels with different stickers on the back. Our son is an honor student. Our son is in med school. Our son is God. Anyway, I just delight in that cartoon. I think that's funny. But in the story of Mary and Gabriel, thinking about what it means in the season for love to have come among us, for faith at its essence, to not be just simply caught up, and I don't want to ruin Sunday's sermon, but not just caught up in statements of faith that we cognitively assent to. And certainly an idea that Jesus didn't come to be like us in order to get us out of this, but that love, that at its essence, what we're celebrating this season is that the word became flesh and dwelt among us. Love became flesh and dwelt among us, and it invited us then to learn that life, to become a reflection of that life and love to one another. It's why John can write, you can't love God and not love your neighbor. This is the very essence of what this is about. Um, we, Chelsea, you and I love Jamie Smith and thinking about what it means to be formed by practices. And part of what we've hoped people got out of these 3 weeks of reflecting on Advent is how keeping time can be a way of shaping us. So, just really briefly, what are some ways that you feel like Advent tries to shape us in love? What are some of your favorite ways that the season tries to counterform us in love?
Yeah. I think in a couple different ways. I mean, you and I were joking that this season, especially this year, uh, Advent coming at this time reminds me that it's not Lent, but I don't get to choose that it's Lent, right? That I get to choose that death, right? We are kind of sitting in that. And so in some sense, Advent, I think, especially for me this year, has been a unique remembering of, right, that joy comes, that hope is present, that in this messiness, that in this confusion and the mystery, that God is here, right? And in so many ways, like God chooses to be with us. God chooses to be in our suffering. God chooses to be in this messiness. And I love that each year Advent comes, right? Each year Lent comes, each year Christmas comes, how we have these rhythms within a year that help to counterform us as well. But a part of what that does, remembering, is really, really important. And right, this is with the Old Testament, right? Remember, you need to remember this, that love, right, is, and some, like, in a lot of ways, love can be really difficult. Love can be hard. Love, we need help with, and we need to remember what it means to love. We need to remember what it means for God to choose to be with us, and for God to be in our joy, but also our sorrow, to be with us, so that we can then be with others. Right? This is where we can't hold onto it. And again, this season, especially this year with Advent, of how we do that, has been challenging, I think, in a good way, in the sense of how do we do this creatively, and the fact that God doesn't give up on us, and that we can be creative, and that there are ways, right? God's imagination is so much bigger than our own, and so we need to remember that and continue to live in ways that counterform, even when sometimes loving my neighbor, as many of us have experienced, means not physically necessarily coming to church, right? And so and that's counterintuitive, right? It used to be, and will most likely be, right? Our bodies coming together will be an act of love, but now it's different. But that doesn't mean that the love has changed, our expression of that, right? Our loving for our neighbors, and exposing where we need to do that better.
Yeah, That's great.
where we need to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that Advent comes at a time where the surroundings make us slow down. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and even the ways we we rightly at times are critical of the ways that the season has been secularized. Um, but not all of the ways that the season has, some of that has hung on. I mean, even gift giving and recognizing. I even love that it comes at the end of the year where people are are incentivized to be charitable and to recognize what we are, who are the needy in our midst, and how do we participate? How do we come together as families? And how do we take more than just a day off? How do we take several days off to rest and to let the land lay fallow and to be together with our friends and family as much as we can be in the season? But yeah, there's some Advent's great for a lot of the ways that it tries to reshape our imaginations. All right, so here we go, folks still out there. Here's your chance for questions. Sharon Castledine already sent us one. Could we say that one way of thinking about love is having hospitable space for the other rather than being so full of self that there's no room? Oh man, absolutely, absolutely. And I do think this is why I've tried to emphasize a few times in preaching, especially in the Old Testament, because I think we think of the Old Testament as such as a place where God's people are so violent. um, Over and over again, God is trying to form a people who are hospitable. And part of what they face as a challenge is they enter into the land as vulnerable people, and the people that they encounter are not hospitable but are violent. And so in some ways, God is having to rescue them from the violence that they're encountering in all of these different folks. But but as God brings them peace and security, they are not to turn around and treat others the way they got treated as they moved into the land. Um, so even I think from in the roots of Torah is this idea that we will be a people who are constantly hospitable and practice economic codes like gleaning, that are ready for that sojourner, and we're not um, we're treating others the way we would want to be treated in that form of hospitality. So yeah, that's a wonderful thought, Sharon. Thanks.
Well, and I hope it's okay to jump in.
Yeah,
One of
no.
the things too, though, is making sure that there is still room for yourself. Because again, this is where, right, we have sides with virtues, right? We have kind of different ends of the spectrum. Love is one where, again, if you don't love yourself, right, then you can't love others, or then it's this malformed way of loving, because right, great commandment, love the Lord your God, but love others as yourself. And so like we have to have that proper view, or that, right, this orientation of love where we are still very much included. Again, that's not always for everyone. Like it depends on us, but sometimes there are those of us who would never sit at the table. And so we need to remember that too, that we do have a seat at the table as well. So
Yeah. While we're waiting for a question, I mean, it does create a kind of random Advent thought for me, and that is that the poor innkeeper oftentimes gets a bad rap during the season, uh, that there's no room at the inn. He wasn't running a Motel 6, but the idea even that they got the stable said there was a form of hospitality that was trying desperately to make space, even where there was no space available, no normal space available. But the text probably has more to say about the way economic systems of census and taxes were pushing Joseph and Mary and their people around in ways that created patterns where there was no space. And so God bless the innkeeper for finding room in the stable. Um, Innkeepers unite. Power to the innkeepers. Um, any other questions or thoughts? Even ways, even some of you who might have ways that you feel like you have been able to ways Advent has shaped you this season, or ways that you have tried to practice joy or love during the season, allowed that to form you.
I was curious if you guys could speak to how our current technologies have allowed us to practice love perhaps in new ways than we were previously ready to explore.
Yeah. Want to take a shot at that, Chelsea?
Sure. I mean, I think this is where I still think there's a little bit of struggle in the sense of trying to figure out right appropriate ways or healthy ways, because sometimes our use of technology can still be unhealthy. At the same time, though, right, I think technology has been such a gift, especially during this time where we are trying to, again, in a lot of ways, not gather in person, and so technology has given us ways to connect with one another. Again, having a webinar where we can share these ideas, where we can, and I don't know how it works, but right, how we can stream on Facebook Live, and how people can have access there, and YouTube, and all of these kinds of different things, where without that already built, it would be really difficult to connect, right? We wouldn't have this ability to see each other's faces. It's still not the same, again, so we mourn different things, but we've also, it's been really fun on Sunday mornings with our live stream. I know that we've had various people from all around the US and just kind of all around to be able to listen and interact and share prayer requests. The prayer request part probably has been one of my favorite pieces of this. And one of the ways to care for one another is how Facebook, right? We will get just prayer requests and we can pray for each other. So some of the ways that I've seen it be really helpful. Yeah, I don't know for you, Scott, what you have seen.
Yeah, and I have
or
a question I'll
experienced.
answer too. Yeah, I do think it makes us aware of needs, and there's a double-edged sword to this. So it is amazing to me through all of the various forms of communication that we can know what is happening around the world in an instant. I think I share in the devotional, we went on a family vacation on an Alaska cruise years ago, and one of our favorite things was the singer sang a folk song about how the Civil War was still going on in the Alaska Gulf weeks after the Civil War was officially over, because no news hadn't gotten there yet. And in some ways, I think generations that have been shaped by these technologies have a sense, and travel technology too, that allows people to be around the world and make that possible. But it can deaden us to needs, and it can overwhelm us. That's the double-edged sword. But it also can make us keenly aware of others, and maybe less prone than to be so nationalistic or self-centered, and recognize both the goodness and the humanity and the needs of people around the world. And even I think it's been interesting to discover needs even in our own community through these days and through the use of technology. Somebody asked me, and this comes out of devotional, can you expand on what you meant by a scandalous people, and why or how we might respond to the call to worship in a scandalous way? Well, yes, it is a scandal. Actually, I'm stealing there from my friend Jamie again, that there's a kind of scandal. So I in other places, I think I've written about how in California, almost every Sunday I would leave our house about 7 a.m. and I would leave kind of in my jacket or suit, and my neighbor almost every Sunday would be walking out his front door at the same time, but in his bathrobe to get his Sunday morning LA Times. And I knew, we knew each other well enough to know, I knew he wasn't coming to church, and I knew he was going to spend Sunday morning drinking coffee and reading the LA Times, which is fine. But the scandal there is that there is a call that has gone out, but not everyone has heard it. And so the scandalous part of the call to worship is that call to worship has formed a particular people within a city or a community and I don't mean it's like, shoo, it's a scandal, but there is a kind of scandalous nature to the fact that there is a call that has gone out that not everyone has heard or responded to yet. It doesn't mean that they haven't been included in that call, but it means that there is a sense in which that call has not yet been responded to or heard by those people. And so the word ecclesia, that means called out ones, it means there's this group of people that are unique because they have been called, and they have responded to that call, which makes them scandalously different, if you will. And that may be pushing the term a little bit, but that's what I meant there. Hopefully that was helpful. Sally says she's intrigued by the term perichoresis. I see how it fits in the Trinity, but is this a concept for God's people as well? My funny answer, Sally, is to say it doesn't apply to Nazarenes, clearly, because of their inability to dance. It used to be because we weren't allowed to dance, but now we realized we weren't allowed to because we're clearly not capable. But go for it, Chelsea. I'm going to say yes, but I'll let you expand on.
Oh no, I was going to say yes. I was starting to get like a silly comment about your generation not being able to dance.
Yeah, you're
fine,
probably fine.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is where, for me, a part of, right, going back to Genesis, right, humanity created in God's image. Well, what is that image? And again, for me, right, this image of dancing, not necessarily, again, literally, because not all of us can dance, which is totally fine. But we are created in the image of constant making space for the other, and constant hospitality, and constant connectedness and interconnectedness. And so yes. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Scott.
Yeah, well, I think if I could push the metaphor or image I was using before of as families, you make space for the other, and even if that space is not accepted or received, or if some tragedy means that person's no longer in that space, you don't get that space back. I do think that's part of the scandal, to use that word again, where Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Like, these people are my mother and my brothers. And what does it mean then for us as God's people to make space at the table for one another, and for that space not to be taken back? There's an Old Testament narrative that I think of often when I think of coming to the table. It's a sermon that I remember my dad preaching. It's where I learned the story. But I love the story of Mephibosheth in the story of David, and it feels like the narrator is telling us the story intentionally. Where, if you remember the story, David says, "Is there anybody left from Jonathan's house that I can show favor to?" And they find out, well, yeah, I mean, there's a son, but when you took power, everybody was sure you were going to kill everybody, and so the nurse ran away and tripped and fell, and Mephibosheth is broken in both ankles. I mean, it is handicapped, is unable to walk. And you have this sense that David says, "Well, bring him in," and the narrative is he sat at the table and was just like one of the king's sons. And I remember my dad saying, kind of the cool image of that is that Mephibosheth is sitting at the table, and when he is sitting at the table, the brokenness of his legs no longer matter. He is just like all of the other sons of David, if you will, or children of David around the table. And I do think that's part of the perichoretic image, is that God makes space in God's self for creation, and it shouldn't surprise us then that God creates. And in a way, and here I'll kind of push my eschatology issue again, but not in a way where even creation then can go away, but where part of the redemption of creation is God has made space in God's self for creation, and therefore will redeem creation and will redeem these people for whom he has made space. And so we as God's people are constantly then finding ways to make space for others at the table, for all the Mephibosheths in the world to be participants at the table. Um, yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, I think,
Yeah, go.
sorry. I was just, well, I think in the scandalousness too is who is invited, right? The fact that
Right.
it is not necessarily limited to those who look like us, those who think like us, those who, right, all kinds of things. And that, right, this is a part of, right, who Jesus ate with would not have been people that everyone would have had dinner with. And so who, right, who Jesus dines with, who Jesus invites to the table, is so against the norm, right, of what it meant for a religious leader or for someone who is spiritual, right, like for the Son of God to claim to be the Son of God and then eat with all those sinners, right, like all of like that aspect of it being so scandalous, and with eschatology, so in times kinds of things, it being scandalous, yeah, that this earth that sometimes we want to say is worthless, right, is something that is a part of that, and can be, going back to the gold, this thing that we think that we need to just be wasteful or that we want to be done with is what is included, and is renewed. It's not all new things, right? He's renewing all things.
Right. Yeah. So these weeks we get to be surprised by joy, and we get to be embraced in God's love. What a great season. As we wind down, I want to pray just a prayer of blessing over us in just a moment. But I also want to wish all of you a wonderful end to Advent, and especially some of you who've been joining us from outside of Nampa and Idaho, all over the place. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick little commercial, and that is to watch for, as we begin January, we're going to begin some new opportunities too for people to connect. We're going to try to find ways to see more faces and do more interaction than we've been able to do in these sessions. But thank you for your participation, and look for some cool things in days to come. But let me pray this final prayer for Advent love. And Chelsea, thanks for joining me tonight. Almighty God, you have invited us to love you and love others. We know love because you have loved us. We celebrate in the season divine love becoming flesh and dwelling among us. Your love is not sentimentality. You love us too much to leave us in brokenness. Your love tells the truth about our lives, but also extends unmerited grace. Your love will not let us go. We are loved. Your Spirit empowers us to love, and we are loved by you, we can risk loving others. Forgive us for our misdirected loves. We have too often learned to love. Have mercy on us for allowing our fears to get in the way of your love. Teach us to love you fully. Help us set aside our fears so that we might love even our enemy. May the world know that there exists a God of incarnational love, because they see that love made real in and through us. And all God's people said, amen. Amen. Go in his peace. Have a wonderful third week of Advent and fourth week of Advent. And a Merry Christmas.